have preached dozens of sermons about Christmas, and as I was studying this week, I saw something new. I saw new things that were standing out to me, things that hit me right between the eyes, that were just like this, how that we have to celebrate what Christ is doing in the midst of Christmas. And there's sometimes that you just read the story and you gloss over these things and you can miss out on them. And so today what we're going to be talking about is the wise men. Now the wise men, do you know much about the wise men? The wise men we celebrate, and a lot of what we celebrate with the wise men is actually legend. A lot of what we celebrate is legend. Let me give you an idea of what I'm talking about. The number of wise men, when we celebrate those wise men, typically we celebrate 3 wise men. And we had 3 wise men in our live nativity. Now, why do we do 3 wise men? Well, typically we do 3 wise men because there are 3 gifts, and we'll talk about those a little bit later here in just a minute. But we do 3 wise men, but honestly, we don't know how many there were. There could have been 5. They could have had their servants with them. There could have been 20 with all the servants. We don't know how many actually came with the wise men. We don't even know how many wise men there were that came to visit Jesus. And so a lot of where we get that is from, you know, that Christmas carol, We Three Kings. You know that Christmas carol? Yeah, I'm sure you've sung it before. We Three Kings of Orient are, bearing gifts as we traveled so far. And so a lot of times we get that 3 from the wise men, but that's actually legend. Another legend that we tend to have is the names of the wise men. And you might be thinking to yourself, the wise men have names? I didn't know that. But the wise men later on traditionally have been given names. And a lot of times those names are used in pageants, or they're used in the retelling of the nativity story. And here's what they are, legend, but here's what they are: Melchior, Gaspar, and Balthazar, okay? And so that's one of the other legends that's along with the wise men. The third one is as a legend that they actually came to the manger. Now, of course, again, we do that at our live nativity, but we don't know that they actually came to the manger scene. In fact, the passage that we'll be looking at today implies that they came to a house. And so that manger scene could have been a while back. And in fact, there's no indication for that. Jesus could have even been a young toddler by the time that they came to visit him. In fact, I think I have a picture of that. Can we put that one up on the screen? We might have a picture of Jesus. Yeah, as a young toddler. He might have already been taking his first steps by the time that the wise men actually came. So as we think about the legend that goes on, today I want to focus on the things, not so much the legend, but what we do know about the wise men. What we do know. And then they are sometimes called magi. A magi can refer to a teacher, a priest, even a physician. Think about that. A magi had several different names. An astrologer, etc. Someone that pursued knowledge. And so today, if you got your Bible, I would like for you to turn with me to Matthew chapter 2. Matthew chapter 2 is where we're going to be just for a little bit. And we're going to see, not the legend, we're going to see what the Bible actually says about these magi. And we're not just going to study the story. We're going to actually learn lessons that they learned that first Christmas that we can apply to our lives today. So in Matthew chapter 2, I'm going to start right here in verse 1. And it says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. This threw me for a loop because I have read this story many, many times. But this just, was brand new. Maybe I glossed over it, and I want you to write it down here today. The thing that I want you to see first and foremost, by the way, we're going to spell the word wise today, is that the wise men, number one, that the W here is that they worshiped deliberately. They worshiped deliberately. Now, this is huge. This is something that I think we miss over and over in the Christmas story. Worshiping the Messiah was their mission. Let me grab that. Worshiping the Messiah was their mission, not their reaction. Worshiping the Messiah was their mission, not their reaction. They did it deliberately. From the time that they took their very first steps on their journey, which could have taken multiple months for them to get from the east all the way over to Palestine and to the area of Bethlehem, from the very first steps, they had a mission, and that mission was to deliberately worship the Messiah. They didn't wait to see the Messiah before they worshiped. They didn't wait to meet the Messiah before they worshiped. Their mission was to worship the Messiah from the beginning. And this is why it's so profound for us today, is because you see, their worship wasn't a reaction to meeting Jesus. Worship was deliberate. Why is that so big? Here's the lesson from the wise men. When I go to church, when I read the Bible, when I serve as a volunteer for any ministry that is taking place in our community or within our church, am I looking to be moved by God when I get there? Or do I have a mindset from the beginning that whatever I'm getting ready to do, I'm going to worship the Lord? Is it when I react? Or am I saying, you know what, even before I do what I'm getting ready to do, I have a mindset of worshiping. In fact, I'm going to do this because I want to worship. Their whole traveling, the reason they traveled multiple, maybe hundreds, if not thousands of miles, is a sense of worshiping Jesus. And so if worship is our reaction, we wait till we get there, and not our mission, if it's not deliberate, then here's what will happen. Inevitably, is that your preferences and expectations will get in the way. Let me give you a great example. So let me say it this way. If you are asked to serve, okay, I'm asked to serve. Maybe it's somewhere in the church, or maybe it's somewhere, maybe with children's ministry, live nativity. Maybe it's something that we've asked you to do. Maybe it's another event that we have going on. And you say, okay, I'll be happy to serve. But then you get there, and it's not as easy as you thought it was going to be. Maybe those kids are rambunctious. Maybe that you got the job that you didn't want. Maybe that when you got there, you were with people that you really don't have a lot in common with. And so when you get there, you react and you go, no, this really wasn't my preference. And so you don't worship because it's not meeting your preferences. What if you go to church and the pastor preaches and you think of it, Pastor Dan, today's sermon was really a 7 out of 10. Hopefully you're not thinking that. So 7 out, is really good, but you didn't quite stick the landing, If you go in with that kind of mentality, whether our church or any church, then you are going in reactionary. You're not going in with an open heart saying, God, I want to worship you no matter what the message looks like. It's about you, God. It's about me asking, how can I apply this to my life? What about the time of worship? What if the words on the screen don't match what you're singing? Or what if someone on the platform or the person next to you, God forbid, be a little pitchy and it just kind of throw you off that particular Sunday? Maybe it's your husband or your wife and you're saying, you're a little pitchy, all right? Maybe something like that. See, you will walk in reactionary. But if you come in like the wise men, and you say, you know what? I'm going to worship deliberately. I'm going to worship no matter what. Because it's not about me. It's not about my preferences. It's not even about my expectations. It's all about you. And that's what happened with these wise men. Look at it one more time at the very end of verse 2. It says, they're talking to Herod here, and it says that we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. Do you see it? The whole time, it was their plan to worship, not based on what had happened. And they could have. They could have looked at this poor family. Maybe he wasn't in the manger, but they could have been at the poor family and said, this is the King of the Jews? This is who I came 1,000 miles for, months traveling. Do you see how a reactionary heart can be detrimental to your worship? That's huge for us to think about. And so I am convinced by this, that we have to be, like the wise men, deliberate about our worship. Well, that's the W. Here's the I. You ready? The wise men, another lesson we can learn from them, is that they investigated diligently. They investigated diligently. Now, as we think through that, I know right here up here on the screen, it says to start at verse 8, but I want us to remind ourselves of what took place. Let's go at verse 3. It says, when King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all of Jerusalem with him. And when he called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Christ was to be born. They reply in verse 5, in Bethlehem in Judea. They replied, for this is what the prophet had written. And so they go back and they see what the prophet had written back in Micah. And it says, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, are by no means least among the rulers of Judea, for out of you will come a ruler who will be the shepherd of my people Israel. So it tells them about Bethlehem. Verse 7. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time that the star had appeared. Now, don't miss this part. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and make a careful search for the child. Now, they were going to do that anyway, okay? Regardless of whether or not Herod had told them to do that. As soon as you find him, though, report to me so that I too may go and worship him. Now, that's the lie part that's in this. Then we get into verse 9, and it says, after they heard the king, they went on their way, and the star that they had seen in the east went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they were overjoyed. And then don't miss this, the first half of verse 11. It says, on coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary. And don't miss it. What was their mission from the beginning? And they bowed down and worshiped him. Now, this whole time, they are looking for him. They are deliberately searching. And this is what I was talking about earlier, that we don't want to replace the search for Jesus with the stress of Christmas. And so here they come, and at the end of their search, they worship him. And this word in verse 11 that is the original Greek word for worship, it's this idea of falling down and prostrating themselves to kiss the hem of the garment of the person who is being honored. And so they can see that they were true seekers after God because God initiated their journey. Whatever way that journey was going to go, they said, God, we're going to respond. And so some have debated about these wise men. Were these pagans? Were they pagans that saw a star? Wise men, magi, are typically astrologers. Were they pagans? We don't know. Did they practice a quasi-science? Were they given to superstition? We don't know. And even if they had some limited spiritual light in their life, they recognized when they saw that star, they recognized that it was a part of God's light that shone upon them. And they were genuine seekers of the Messiah. And over, I am convinced that like the wise men, it doesn't matter how you come to Jesus. It doesn't matter your past if you were a pagan. It doesn't matter what things you have done. And it really doesn't matter what gets you to Jesus. It may be a star, it may be a person, it may be whatever. But as long as you continue searching and don't give up. We mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, but maybe your star, the thing that brought you to Jesus and is keeping you there, is your kids. Maybe it's your teenagers. And you say, you know what? That is what's keeping me there. Maybe what's bringing you to Jesus is your pain. You've said, this has been a tough year, a hard year. I'm grieving. I've got a health problem. My finances are array. And that's the thing that has been driving you to Jesus. Praise God for your pain that has brought you to Jesus and is keeping you there. It might even be your pride that brings you to Jesus. Let me tell you a story. There's an author. He's written several books over the past several years. His name is Lee Strobel, and he wrote this book called The Case for Christ. Some of y'all have heard about it. And in this book, The Case for Christ, he was a reporter. And as a reporter, he was an atheist reporter, and he thought to himself, you know what? I'm going to go out and I'm going to disprove that Jesus is the Christ. And I'm going to meet with all the best professors, and I'm going to meet with all the best people, and I'm going to prove them wrong. His pride led him in to doing that discovery. And so what happened though, as time goes on, is he keeps putting the dots together, and he says, this is not something that is made up. This is something very real. And the book, The Case for Christ, is his journey in pride, but it was his star in the sense that it brought him to Christ. And he is a believing Christian who writes books and gives lectures and encourages people to come to Christ who have all kinds of doubts. It doesn't matter what brings you to Christ. I was going and doing a Start Here class many years ago. And I had a lady in our Start Here class. Some of y'all have gone through that yourselves. Had a lady in there, and as we were going through it, she and her partner, I don't like that name, but she and her partner were living together. And as we were talking about what it means to be a follower of Christ and what it means to be a member of Memorial, and we were talking about having God's best for your life, God's best. I said, and it's right there in the curriculum, I said, God's best for your life is not for you to live together. God's best for your life is for you to be under the covenant of marriage. And so I mentioned that to her. Well, guess who came with her the following week? Yes, he did. And so he comes the next week, and now we're sitting down and we're talking about all these different things. Lo and behold, accepted Christ, got baptized, and then I had the honor of officiating their wedding. It doesn't matter if it's a class. It doesn't matter if it's your pride. It doesn't matter if it's your kids. It doesn't matter if it's your pain. The thing is that you search for Him. And like the wise men, we want to investigate diligently. It doesn't matter how you get to Jesus, but shame on you if you ever stop searching. He hears every prayer. He sees every triumph. He sees every tear. And those wise men did not give up until they found Him, and neither should we. The third thing, the S. The wise men surrendered their gifts willingly. Surrendered their gifts willingly. We only have half a verse for this one. At the second part of verse 11 says that these wise men, that they opened their treasures and presented Him with gifts of gold and incense, or your Bibles will say frankincense, and of myrrh. Now, these were different gifts with deep significance. I want to talk to you very briefly about what they mean. So the first thing that was given was the gold. And so this gold represented royalty. And no doubt it was used by this poor family when they had to escape to Egypt. Remember that part of the story? They have to escape to Egypt. They were going to need some money for that. And so the gold that was given them, I'm sure, was used for that. But gold represents royalty. That they were given, that this is the King of Kings. This is the Lord of Lords. This is the Messiah. This isn't just some baby in the manger. This is royalty. And then there was the frankincense. Think about frankincense. Do you even know about frankincense? Frankincense, let me explain this. It was a costly, beautiful smelling incense that was used on a couple of different special occasions. In the Old Testament, it was stored in a special chamber that they had in front of the temple. And it was sprinkled on certain offerings as a symbol of the people's desire to please the Lord. And so here they are. You've got this frankincense that was sometimes used in different ways, but a lot of times it was used at the temple. It was used for worship. It was used for sacrifice. It was used for multiple different things. And so for here, that represents the deity of Christ. So you got the gold, which represents his royalty. You've got the frankincense that represents his deity. It had been used in the temple time and time again for the worship of God, and so it represents his deity. The final thing is the myrrh. Now, myrrh, it was also a perfume. Think, man, these guys are all about their perfume during the holidays. Not quite as expensive as frankincense, but it was still valuable. If you mixed it with wine, you could actually use it as an anesthetic. Isn't that interesting? You could use it as an anesthetic. But if you mixed it with other spices, they would typically use that mixture as a preparation of bodies for burial. What does that foretell? Foretells the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. And so you have the gold for his royalty, you have the frankincense for his deity, and then you have the myrrh, and that represents his humanity. He died for our sins. And that's what worshiping Jesus as your Lord does. It makes you realize everything is his. They surrendered these gifts willingly. And as I thought about that, as I thought about how these different gifts had significance, they weren't just like they weren't tipping God. They were giving him gifts that actually meant something. Now I got to ask you this question. Do you have a person in your life, maybe it's someone in your family, that they are one of the hardest people to buy gifts for? Do you have that person in your life? They are just like the hardest person to buy a gift for. I was watching an interview last night of Tim Tebow with his wife. And they were just doing this interview for Christmas. He's in a couple of ministries. And so they were just interviewing them just for fun. And she looks at him, his wife looks at him and says, "He is so hard to buy gifts for." Because that's what she sounds like. And so make a long story short, he's got these gifts. And he said, "I'm really not that hard." But I think about that. We all have this person in our life that perhaps they are so hard to buy a gift for. Now, let me put this into perspective. What do you give someone who has everything? What do you give God who has everything? Y'all have given me some great answers right here. You give him a surrendered life. Yeah, your time, your talents, your worship, your sacrifice. What do you give the one that has everything? You give him yourself. You give him yourself. They surrendered their gifts willingly. Let me ask you this question as we go into Christmas and as we think about these lessons from the wise men. Have you surrendered yourself to Jesus? There's only one gift that you can give him, and that's all of yourself. Have you given all of yourself to him? Last thing, wise men, E, embraced instruction obediently. They embraced instruction obediently. What do you mean by that, Pastor Dan? Well, let's look at verse 12. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. So they worshiped deliberately, they investigated diligently, they surrendered their gifts willingly, and they embraced the instruction of the Lord in that dream obediently. Now, up until this point, over and over in the Old Testament, there are characters that God gave them a command. God gives characters in the Bible, including us, we'll get to that in a second, but God has given characters in the Bible. He gives them a direct command and they disobey. And then there's the consequences that go along with that. I mean, let's just think about it. Let's just start from the beginning, Adam and Eve. God gave them a command. Hey, listen, you got all these trees. You got all these trees. Just don't eat from this one. And what do? They were tempted and they ate from it. And so we have the consequences of that. Think about Moses. Moses was told to speak to the rock to draw water, and he struck the rock to draw water. And while God was gracious to still give the people water, the consequences were for Moses that he did not get to go into the promised land because of that action. Think about King Saul. He was told to destroy the Amalekites and all their possessions. And he destroyed the Amalekites, but he kept some of those possessions. And then I think there are even more people and that God gave specific commands. He gives these commands to, these aren't pagans. These are deeply spiritual people. Moses, come on. And he gives these commands to deeply spiritual people, people who loved God and they didn't follow and it cost them dearly. But the wise men in contrast, embraced the instruction obediently, setting an example for us to heed God's guidance and to avoid the costly consequences of disobedience. I want to put this picture up here on the screen. We have a little goat that we put up here. On Monday, the owner of all the animals in our live nativity came and picked them up. And after he had called them all, and he had picked them all up and put them into the back of his truck, there was one little goat who was behind the hay, who poked his head up, and his hair was matted to his head. I imagine it kind of like Home Alone, Mom, I made my family disappear. He got left behind. This little goat got left behind. Thank God Miss Heidi is right here. Apparently the ladies in the ELC they kept hearing this little bleating, and they knew that the owner had come and he picked him up. They kept hearing this little bleating, and what's going on? Bah, and so here they are. And so Miss Heidi, our ELC director, goes out there, and here she is. You can see the picture of her. She's comforting this little goat. And the whole idea is he didn't come when he was called, and he got left behind. Can I ask you this Christmas, with all the hustle and bustle that's been happening this week? By the way, the owner did come back and get it. We don't have a pet goat wandering around Memorial right now. But can I ask you this Christmas, with all the hustle and bustle that's been happening this week, have you stopped and have you asked God, what are you calling me to do this Christmas? What are you calling me to do? The new year is right around the corner. What are you calling me to do? I want to be obedient. Sometimes we have our ears so closed. Lord, are you calling me to get saved? Lord, I've been going to church and, off and on throughout the years, and I've been a religious person, but maybe that you've never given your heart to Him. Maybe that God is calling you to be obedient. He's saying, you need to give your life to me. And you haven't done that. You go to church, you pray, you sing the songs when they sing the songs, but I don't know you. I need you to give your life to me. Maybe that your obedience is to be baptized. We've been having an incredible time of baptism this past year. And I don't think we're done yet. I think God is still looking at many of you saying, the first step of your obedience of knowing me is to be baptized. Because if you compromise on your baptism, then you will inevitably compromise on anything else. It's that first step of obedience. Maybe you need to rededicate your life to the Lord. Maybe you just need to volunteer and get involved. What do you need to give the one who has everything? You give Him yourself. Wherever, whenever I'll go, I'll obey this Christmas.